Soon it'll be 2 years since Israel endured its worst day of bloodshed and terror in its history. At the time, here in France, home to Europe's largest Jewish community, a majority expected and even supported a forceful reaction. Nearly 2 years on, the sympathy has long waned. Yes, Hamas still holds hostages, but public opinion in France and elsewhere has long turned. Long before a summer of daily images of desperate Gazans braving bullets to reach aid distribution points, the United Nations last week formally labeling it a famine. A tipping point? Yes and no. Sure, traditional Western allies are banding together to up the pressure on Israel over the stranglehold on Gaza and the increased destruction of Palestinian livelihoods in the West Bank. But all Benjamin Netanyahu needs is one ally, the strongest one, and he's got it, the United States of America. To President Macron's coalition of states ready to recognize a Palestinian state at the UN next month, the new U.S. ambassador to France replies, Paris is stoking anti-Semitism. If Washington's okay with the crushing of civilians in Gaza and a further land grab in the West Bank, then what can be done? Today in the France 24 debate, Israel defying the international community. And with us from Privas in southern France, retired French ambassador to Lebanon, Patrice Paoli, one of the co-signatories of a recent open letter by diplomats calling on France to retake the initiative in the region. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Good evening.
From Tel Aviv, political scientist Alan Yachter, senior lecturer at Tel Aviv University. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Peace negotiator Nomi Bar Yaakov is associate fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Thank you for being with us here in Paris.
Thank you very much for having me in the studio, Francois.
And John Linden, executive director of the umbrella organization, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, ALMEP. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
New season for the show. You can always, by the way, listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. The images are indeed unbearable. Latest example, Israeli strikes hitting the main hospital in the southern Gaza city of Han Yunis, not once but twice. Among the 20 dead, 5 journalists, including 33-year-old Mariam Daga, a video reporter, most notably worked for the Associated Press news agency. The dead also include contractors for Reuters and Al Jazeera. At least 240 journalists have been killed in Gaza in the past 19 months. Take one step back, John Linden, and you kind of get the sense that viewers at this point in late August are dulled by it, are paying attention or not anymore?
I think if you look at the reaction around the world to the events today, I hope there isn't fatigue. I mean, it's quite a grisly question, but the situation on the ground grows worse by the day. So if people's inattention is growing, the situation they're responding to is more grisly and inhumane and unjustifiable day after day. And I think what you're seeing, what I'm certainly hearing from both diplomats and society in Europe and the United States, is a sense of frustration that we can't grip this and change it and disrupt it and end this war, a war that nobody expected would be approaching its second anniversary with no end in sight. And it's a crisis for the international community as a result. Lots of people I speak to who don't particularly care about Israel-Palestine ordinarily are actually quite worried about what it's doing to our international norms, the sense of international law, an idea that there's something called an international community that has a right and a responsibility to intervene. All of those things are in the biggest crisis of my lifetime. And we have to end this war for Israelis and Palestinians primarily, but we also need to do it to reassert important international norms that we're going to need in the 21st century.
Now, Alan Yachter, we're not sitting in Tel Aviv like you are. I know that there was over the weekend a missile from Yemen with fragmentation bombs. Is that where the conversation is, or are people there where you are paying attention to what's going on in Gaza?
So weirdly enough, the attacks from Yemen have already been so normalized, especially after the Iranian attacks, that people forget about them after a couple of days. The main conversation is about Gaza and about the looming plans to go on a new campaign, possibly conquering Gaza City, and a lot of criticism about the government not aiming for a deal or not really clear in its intentions. The conversation, however, is mostly about Israeli interests, not so much about the situation in Gaza for the locals.
All right, mostly about Israeli interests. Patrice Paoli, you heard a moment ago John Linden talking about how people who don't usually pay attention to the Middle East are worried about international values and norms being degraded with what's going on. We'll go over later that what you have put in that open letter. But one of the things was access to international journalists. And again, it's 5 more journalists killed this Monday.
Yes, well, certainly there are many things that should be done. The first thing is to go back to international law. That is our guide. That's what we should be fighting for. Access is important for the journalists because that would be giving more information. I don't know if the public opinion is not concerned about what is going on in Gaza. I think in France, at least, it is a subject of great attention. It has come into the national debate. I think that what is at stake also is the accusation of double standards. We show a great attention to international law as the international community, as the European Union. In Ukraine, why don't we fight for the implementation of same principles in Gaza in a more forceful way? Not that we're not saying things, but we should translate what we say into more effective decision measures to stop the disaster that is going on in Gaza now.
Nomi Bar Yaakov, you could add that to, say, something like Sudan. We look at it dispassionately. We don't have a stake in the fight in what's going on in Sudan. So we look at it and we see when the RSF are crushing local populations in Darfur, it's easy to call a spade a spade. When it comes to the Middle East, and you're sitting here in Europe like you are today, there's the weight of history.
Yes. There is definitely the weight of history, but I think that the pendulum is shifting. I think that whereas in the past, Israel, born on the heels of the Holocaust, was given some leeway in the way that it was dealing with the Palestinians, I think now, given the scale of the horror in Gaza, and frankly also in the West Bank, there's a very clear intention of the current government to annex the West Bank and to forcibly displace, ethnically cleanse as many Palestinians as possible from the West Bank. It doesn't get much attention, but a very extreme minister, Bezalel Smotrich, was given the power by Prime Minister Netanyahu not only to be the finance minister and be in charge of the coffers and divert so much money to his mission in life, which is to annex the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and settle it. So I think the world, given the scale of what is happening, is putting history aside. Even Germany for a very long time never criticized Israel, given the history. And they were the first to criticize Israel last month. So it's, and last week again, and they were the first to say they are not going to send Israel any arms. And so it is, and there was like no arms at all. It wasn't, oh, we're not going to send this bomb for a week or that bomb for 3 days, and, you know, as leverage. So it really is time for any state leader, any company that has leverage over Israel to exercise it, because where we're heading is very clear, and it is very clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu will not stop the war unless he is stopped by someone that has leverage of him. So it's not just US President Trump that has leverage. He has the most leverage. But if everyone unites together, there is a collective leverage, and there's a collective sense in the community that this must change. And people like John working with communities, it's time to empower the communities that are fighting for peace.
All right. And there is, just on this question of the weight of history, a bit of a generational gap. Here in Paris, it was closing night of the big Rock en Seine festival on Sunday. Irish rap trio Kneecap opened their set with a chant of Free, Free Palestine before later insisting they were not against Israel. They were under close scrutiny by France's conservative interior minister, who said he'd be looking out for any inflammatory remarks. They faced charges in the UK over the waving of a Hezbollah flag at a concert last fall in London. John Linden, in the crowd, There were Irish jerseys, the band from Belfast, but there were also keffiyehs. And again, this weight of history, does the younger generation have it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing this. We see polling actually, not just in Europe, in the United States. There's a huge generational shift amongst young people for whom the Holocaust, quite frankly, to Naomi's point, it weighs much less heavily in their consciousness. They don't remember the Oslo Accords. They were born after them. They've only really ever encountered an Israel where Prime Minister Netanyahu was in charge. So their conception of Israel is very, very different to their parents' generation. And what they've seen is a succession of wars in Gaza preceding this most horrific one. So an 18 to 20-year-old person, I was speaking to some of them last week, coincidentally, they don't have any other data to draw upon other than what everybody agrees is the most right-wing and extreme and ideologically driven government in Israel's history. And then, of course, all politics are local. They're also angry at their own governments for many, many reasons. And the double standard that was pointed out earlier on, they see this. They say, we don't believe our governments when it comes to taxation, redistribution, democracy, and Palestine. It's part of a wider critique that many young people have within liberal democracies. And I do worry, we see it this week, or last week rather, the Dutch government, it's an interim government, it collapsed over this issue. There's coalition fragmentation in Finland right now over it. In fact, we saw a statement from the Prime Minister this afternoon trying to address this. In Belgium, there is also problems with the coalition over this issue. And we see it in the UK, in France, creating real problems within governing majorities in parliaments, unless the international community, and Europe in particular, is able to demonstrate that these kind of increasingly rhetorically overblown statements are matched with some way of affecting and impacting the reality. They're going to lose young people, not just over international issues, but also around faith about liberal democracy, in a sense that people turning out in the streets or voting for a policy actually affects change. The stakes are very high.
All right, and we're going to get to some of the propositions you have on this matter. You mentioned it's not just Europe, and you said so. A Gallup poll published earlier this month found only 32% of Americans back Israel's military action in Gaza, down from 50% in late 2023. The Week website, quoting the Los Angeles Times columnist Jackie Colmes's line about the transformation of Israel's image from David to Goliath, from righteous to wrathful. How many Israelis share that view, Alan Yachter? And is that a concern, this public opinion in the U.S.?
So in general, when we look at surveys, we see that just a survey released this month in Israel showed that 70-80% of Israelis are very much concerned about global public opinion and the deteriorating image of Israel in the world. We also have to remember Israel has a large high-tech industry and a secular liberal sector that is harmed directly by being disconnected and put aside in the eyes of the Western world. At the same time, unlike what was described now about young Europeans, in Israel, the Holocaust is very much evident. It's being taught in schools. There's an annual Memorial Day. And I think there's a growing gap here, a misunderstanding on how can the world not see, to the eyes of Israelis, that this is a continuation of past persecutions. That's the common narrative here. So there's this growing misunderstanding of maybe we're just not explaining ourselves well enough. So they blame the government for not explaining why we are on the good side of the.
And in the last minutes, Naomi Bar Yaakov, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying he, quote, regrets the tragic mishap after that strike on the main hospital in southern Gaza that killed 20, including 5 journalists.
Well, he's only saying that because US President Trump said he was not notified of the bombings of Nasser Hospital in Han Yunis prior to the bombing, and that he was horrified by it. And when President Trump condemns something, then Prime Minister Netanyahu reacts. But time and time and time again, the Israeli Defense, the IDF, and Prime Minister Netanyahu said, oh, this is an error, this wasn't intentional, we are investigating. And it's not really an error, and they're not really investigating, and I somehow doubt that this statement is genuine.
All right, Israel, which, as Naomi is hinting, has backup. 6 weeks in, the new U.S. ambassador to France, who's also father-in-law to President Trump's daughter Ivanka, summoned by the French Foreign Ministry for lecturing his hosts on anti-Semitism. Charlotte Lamb has more.
Ahead of the 81st anniversary of the liberation of Paris, which ended the deportation of French Jews, the US ambassador to France marked the day with a warning. In a letter to American press Sunday, Charles Kushner accused French President Emmanuel Macron of failing to tackle anti-Semitism, calling it a stain that has long scarred French life.
In France, not a day passes without Jews assaulted in the street, synagogues or schools defaced, or Jewish-owned businesses vandalized. Your own Interior Ministry has reported anti-Semitic incidents, even at preschools.
Just hours later, France's foreign ministry hit back, summoning Kushner and calling the allegations unacceptable.
They contravene international law, in particular the duty not to interfere in the internal affairs of states, as provided for in the 1961 Vienna Convention governing diplomatic relations.
Kushner is Jewish, and his son is married to US President Donald Trump's daughter Ivanka. His letter echoes comments by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who last week accused the French president of fueling anti-Semitism by backing recognition of a Palestinian state. Kushner also wrote,
Gestures towards recognition of a Palestinian state embolden extremists, fuel violence, and endanger Jewish life in France.
Nearly 2 years into the war in Gaza, France plans to join other countries in formally acknowledging Palestinian statehood next month at the UN General Assembly. Macron made the announcement in July, saying peace was possible and there was no alternative. He has previously called anti-Semitism contrary to French values and boosted security at synagogues and Jewish sites across France.
Ambassador Paoli, the statistics from the French Interior Ministry do show a spike in anti-Semitic acts. What was your reaction, though, when you saw this open letter?
Well, I think that the reaction first of all, I don't have all the figures, and I'm not in the administration government anymore, but I think that the reaction by our Ministry of Foreign Affairs was right. This is appalling. It's not acceptable. And in general, when you want to disqualify someone who is criticizing the policies of the Netanyahu government, you accuse him of being anti-Semitic, which in the case of France has no ground. Second, I would like to say that I fully agree with everything that Nomi Bar Yaakov just said, and that we should mobilize. And that's precisely because we are trying to mobilize not only our authorities, but that we should work with like-minded countries in the European Union, but also with partners outside to put pressure on the Israeli government to change its policies. In Gaza, in the West Bank, as Nomi Bar Yaakov said, everywhere. So we have to mobilize, and we should be in this more proactive action, and we will be accused even more of having biased policies, but I think that there is no alternative.
All right, let's talk about some of those. Let's talk about some of those proposals you spelled out in a open letter that was published in French newspaper Le Monde earlier this month. 34 French ambassadors, including yourself. Among the demands that you listed, the suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement as long as this state, Israel in case, fails to respect Article 2 of the Human Rights Act. Tell us about the EU-Israel Association Agreement, and is it realistic to expect all 27 to sign on to a suspension?
Well, it was put on the agenda of the EU member states. No decision has been made until now. You saw what happened in the Netherlands when the Minister of Foreign Affairs resigned because he thought that he could not convince his fellow ministers to adopt more effective measures against the Netanyahu government to convince him to stop his aggression in Gaza, his attacks in Gaza. So definitely, I don't know if we can have an agreement, but it does not mean that we should not try to build alliances within the EU among like-minded countries, like as it's the case now as far as the recognition of the Palestinian state is concerned, but with partners outside, like Norway, Arab countries, whoever is willing to join. So I don't know if we can make a decision collectively to suspend the agreement. I think it would be normal to suspend it according to Article 2 of the Association Agreement. But if we cannot do that, at least we can try to rally a number of partners on other measures.
Other measures, John Linden, it doesn't sound like that's about to happen, is it? The suspension of this association agreement between the European Union and Israel. What would be an effective measure that can be done without acting as 27?
Well, I'm not an expert on how this works at the EU Council level, but there are other measures that Europe can take absent unanimity that don't require a full vote. They can have a qualified majority vote where it has to be a certain proportion of the population and the member states, absent full suspension of the association agreement. But I think it's very, very important that there is two paths laid out to Israelis and to Palestinians. Down one path, where there's continued war, human rights violations, war crimes, there is going to be international isolation and consequences. And then this other path, which I actually think President Macron and Crown Prince bin Salman have been laying out in the last few months, there's a very different future of regional integration of Israel fully integrated into the Middle East, a Palestinian fully sovereign state, a horizon that young people in the region can believe in, that can provide security and prosperity. I was in New York at the end of July with Foreign Minister Barrot and the Saudi Foreign Minister bin Farhan, where we were delivering civil society recommendations generated here in Paris in June at a conference that President Macron put together. And you could see hundreds of ideas developed by civil society, by diplomats. It was 20 governments, the Arab League, the European Union. And I think that is actually a kernel of what we need to see.
But where's the cold, hard pressure?
That's the bit that's missing. So we have the path that I talked about, articulating this positive vision that I think can inspire Israelis and Palestinians. What is absent is for want of a better word, the stick to go alongside the carrot. And for some European leaders, it's very convenient that they have to wait for Donald Trump. So as soon as Donald Trump changes his mind, and we saw maybe an inkling today, we overinterpret these tweets that he's upset in some way with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
He said recently in the last minutes, they're going to have to get things settled soon in Gaza.
Right, but then he said, like last week, that they have to finish the job in Gaza as well. So I prefer if European foreign policy wasn't determined by the tweets of the President of the United States, and instead Europe, G7 partners, the Arab League, we stepped forward with a bold plan that included both sticks and carrots, and that perhaps could persuade the United States to join it, but either way had momentum. And the Arab states are critical here.
Exactly.
We found in a poll that we ran at Allmap earlier this summer, whilst support for a two-state solution in Israel is low, it's below 50% and it has been for a decade. Once you add in regional normalization with Saudi Arabia, you can get a majority of Israelis that are willing to support that. So what we need to see is a diplomatic horizon stored, and then, as Nomi was saying, civil society to weigh in behind it, to persuade people in Hebrew and Arabic that this is the path they must go down.
You need much closer relationships between Europe, and what Macron is doing with Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, is absolutely right, because Europe alone is not going to do it. The Arab states are the ones that actually need to weigh in. They need to weigh in in a heavy fashion, and they need to be united, and they have not been united, and that's part of the problem. So if you can you're not going to get 100% unanimity in the Gulf, and you're not going to get 100% unanimity in Europe, but you get the majority working together, and that in and of itself is a huge weight, because the Arab plan is on the table since January for transitional authority in Gaza, run by a technocratic government with European support, led by the Gulf, and security presumably will have to come from the US. At the moment, Israel is insisting on it. But I think there is scope for the US to run it, not like they're running the GFH, not like they're running the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, because this is going to be the Arab states and the neighboring states, Egypt and Jordan, with European support. We've already seen Europe deal with border issues in the past when there were agreements. So expertise is there, lessons are learned, and there has to be a cohesive approach. So there is that weight that you're talking about, Francois. You know, we're all the time waiting, as John has said, for the weight to come from the US. Europe, so often I go into the FCDO, the Foreign Office in the UK, now Foreign and Development Office, and they say, what's the policy in the Middle East peace process? And they'll say, oh, we're waiting for the US, we're waiting for Washington. And it's the same in Brussels, where there's all this waiting for Washington. So it's time. Trump has made it very clear he does not want the Europe to be dependent on the US. This is in the context of defense, it's in the context of Ukraine, it's also in the context of Gaza. So it's time for Europe to ally itself with the Gulf, because ultimately Saudi Arabian Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, want normalization and peace with Israel. They can't do it without a Palestinian state, and they can't do it without Europe.
All right, Alan Yachter, I don't know if you're a betting man, but if you had to choose between what's just been described here in the studios, kind of the EU and the Gulf states banding together to propose an alternate vision that means growth for all sides, or what the United States is pursuing. And by the way, the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, Tom Barak, he's in Damascus right now. Syria, I say that Syria. He's for the Middle East. He's been shuttling back and forth between Lebanon, Israel, and now Damascus. Who would you bet your money on?
In terms of success, right now the money's on the US. I think Europe is already couched to Israeli eyes as has already been decided to be against Israel at this point. And more so, I think Netanyahu at this point plays a game where he's just ignoring everyone. And the proposals that were described now, the combined proposal by European and moderate Gulf countries is actually very popular among most Israelis. I think selling this idea could put pressure on Netanyahu, but what we see so far is that Netanyahu has stopped counting on public opinion. Right now, he's mostly capitulating when Trump tells him to, basically. So I think the pressure from that side has to be really coordinated and immense and targeted on him. Otherwise, my money continues to be on Trump's pressure.
Patrice Paoli, do you agree?
Well, I agree that Netanyahu does not care much about public opinion, but he's also voluntary prisoner of two ministers in his government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who are advocating openly racist and very extreme policies. I agree that it's very difficult, but it's not because it's difficult that we should not do it. And I would go back to the idea expressed by Nomi and John that we should be working on building momentum or coalitions to put pressure and also to bring about a political perspective, showing what is the alternative to the two-state solution. People say that it is dead, but what can you propose instead of it? What is there instead of the two-state solution? Is there a one state with the equal citizenship for everyone, total exclusion of the Palestinians? So we have to go back to the basics, international law. The end game should be a two-state solution with the support of as many partners as was said by other participants in this roundtable. I think that it is the main option. And then to put pressure, we maybe we don't have many sticks, but we do have means to put pressure that would be taken into consideration, at least maybe by other actors in Israel than the government, by going the full way with the ICC, by refusing to sell arms to Israel to continue the war, refuse any goods that come from settlements, because we cannot separate the West Bank from Gaza, and we have to be very careful also about what is going on in the West Bank. So there is probably an array of decisions we can make collectively that would have some meaning.
And by the way, in that open letter that you penned earlier this month with those 33 other former French ambassadors, you talked about pressing charges against French nationals who've committed crimes in Gaza and the West Bank. I presume you mean hardline West Bank settlers who hold French passports. How easy would that be?
I don't know how things. Nothing can be called easy in this situation. I just think that we have to name a number of items that we should be working on, and we are calling on our governments to do so. We will be also joining an appeal by EU former ambassadors along those lines on a number of measures we want to see be taken by our governments, by the EU institutions. Including those that we mentioned, but there are many others that we can take.
So, Nomi Bar Yaakov, September 23rd, New York City, it's UN week, and there's this buildup right now. If things stay the way they are, with the campaign in Gaza continuing, that push to reoccupy Gaza City, if there's still the daily killings that are taking place at aid distribution points, nations, including France, taking the mostly symbolic step of recognizing a Palestinian state. What needs to accompany that in the next month to go along with that?
Well, first, we haven't discussed the ceasefire at all, and I feel quite bad. I think we need to remember that it is absolutely vital to push now for an immediate ceasefire. There is a proposal on the table that Hamas have accepted, that Qatar and Egypt are pushing very, very hard for, and they're actually lobbying in Europe. They're lobbying Europeans to have it. And tomorrow there is a meeting tomorrow morning of the Israeli cabinet to discuss it. So again, that's where pressure can come, because the only way that we'll get any respite and any movement forward is if we have a ceasefire and if the hostages are released. Now, Trump has said this week and last week that there are no longer 20 hostages alive. Israel's denying it, saying they don't know, but I'm sure that they do know, and I'm sure that he knows what he's talking about. He wouldn't make it up. So hostages are dying because of dire conditions or because of Israeli actions or combination of both. And it's time to get the hostages out, and then Netanyahu won't have an excuse to wage any war in Gaza. So I think that we also need to sort of remember the broader context. That said, you know, the United Nations, so it much depends between now and the 23rd of September. Another dynamic is Smotrich, the most extreme minister in the Israeli government, who in 2017 pronounced both in writing and orally that his mission in life is to annex the West Bank and Gaza and settle it with Jews. He is calling for annexation now before September, so as to avoid the whole issue with this Palestinian state, because he's saying if there is formal annexation of the West Bank now, then there won't be a Palestinian state. It's sort of the nail in the coffin, the last nail in the coffin of a Palestinian state. So there is.
Can he do that? Would he do that?
Of course he can do it.
Can Prime Minister Netanyahu do that?
Yes, he can do anything. You know, he's been acting against.
Between now and September 23rd.
I see it only depending on what the U.S. and the Gulf states. You know, I always say President Trump is the man who has the most leverage on Prime Minister Netanyahu. He won't do it if President Trump blocks him from doing it. Israel is existentially dependent on the U.S. So if Trump decides to exercise the leverage that he has and says, look, we will not support you, we will not give you military aid, we will not give you, then he won't be able to do it. But you have an ambassador to Israel, David Huckabee, who is pro-annexation. So, you know, he's an extreme Christian evangelical who would like to annex it. So the question is, where is Trump? Sitting between all of his advisors, and he's pivoting. Trump is pivoting constantly. So there is a danger there. And that's where the Gulf states come in, because they're the ones that have the leverage, the rich ones, the Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They have leverage over Trump because of the deal. So you need to see who is exercising the most leverage over whom and when. So that's where we're at. That's the sort of matrix of it all. And those are the balls that you need to align. And the alignment has to be on imposing a ceasefire now.
All right. And what if the change didn't come from abroad? What if it came from inside of Israel? The former defense minister, Benny Gantz, on Saturday, calling for a national unity government.
Not happening.
I call on Netanyahu, Yair Lapid, Avigdor Lieberman. The time has come for a government of redemption for hostages, supporting servicemen and limited in time. Within 6 months, we will complete these two tasks and proceed to elections.
Alan Yachter, spoiler, Nomi Bar Yaakov just said that's not happening. But why can't it happen?
It can happen because of Netanyahu. So ironically, what the statements show now by Benjamin Gantz is a desperate act, because he's probably not going to win any votes in the next election as things stand. But ironically enough, what he's proposing is what most Israelis want. The government currently is growingly disconnected from public opinion. What most Israelis want right now is a deal to return the hostages, even at with the ceasefire, even at the cost of ending the war in the long term, and an election. This government is extremely unpopular right now, and ironically, that's the reason that they're so adamantly trying to get to stick to power and talk about annexation and about these extreme measures that are not very supported by a majority of Israelis. And I think that's these cracks are starting to show. And I think there is some promise in trying to work with these factions of Israeli society. We've seen the largest demonstration since the war started last week. There's another one planned for tomorrow. 400,000 Israelis went out and protested against the war plans to conquer Gaza City. So there's definitely pressure building from within, but when the government doesn't care about this pressure, it only makes it stick to power more strongly.
Hey, because you say now or never for an opposition politician like Benny Gantz, it's also now or never, perhaps, if what you're saying is accurate about the unpopularity of the far-right elements inside the government for them too. So can they go for broke and do this annexation of the West Bank and Gaza?
If it was up to them, I'm convinced they would. They're definitely diverting a lot of budget money to these causes. They're prolonging the war. These factions of the government are speaking explicitly about explosion and building new settlements in Gaza.
Go ahead, sorry.
I think overall, the main valve that stops them right now is Benjamin Netanyahu's fear that this would upset the U.S. and would be a step too far in the eyes of all the actors, including in the Gulf and including in Europe and in the U.S.
But it can go either way, John Linden. So I'll ask you the same question we posed earlier, which is, how do you see the scenario, the timeline, and what's the way to get to change the dynamic between now and September 23rd?
Well, that's a short timeline, but I think it's outside in and bottom up, right? So outside in, Trump, as mercurial as he is, he wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's terrible to build a strategy around that, but we don't have an awful lot else to work with. And this is the most intractable conflict in the world. And this is a man with a very large and significant ego and sense of himself and his role in world affairs, who is also very deeply engaged with some of the Gulf regimes that Naomi mentioned. So there's a way in which to incentivize Trump, and it's linked to what we just heard about the demonstrations as well. So tomorrow we're going to see another one. And I happen to know that pictures from the one last Sunday from 8 days ago were shown to Donald Trump. And they said, look, there's 400,000 Israelis out here calling for a ceasefire. That's not what you're hearing from Benjamin Netanyahu or from the ambassador in DC or from Mike Huckabee in Jerusalem. And I think if he can be persuaded from this bottom-up change, you ask, can the change come from inside Israel? Yes, absolutely. Because I don't know many societies where hundreds of thousands of people go to march week after week, where general strikes are being called. And what that can do is change the political dynamics in the opposition side. Unfortunately, most opposition leaders in Israel are not profiles in courage. They need to see that there's a huge growing base of Israelis that are anti this war, and that will incentivize them to move. And then, to the outside in part, we need Trump and the Gulf states to be able to come to New York. And in a strange way, Macron and MBS doing what they're doing creates an opening for Trump to have to do something. Yeah. Right? And I actually, people in the studio probably do this not often enough. I want to actually applaud and congratulate President Macron for actually doing something. Now, everybody can critique what the steps were and different details around it, but we have endless rhetoric and no action. And President Macron decided to embark on a process over the summer, which is now resulting in a full day of discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the General Assembly and several countries recognizing a state of Palestine. Everybody can have critiques, but that's a material shift and change. If we had more world leaders taking action, putting these plans together, it would disrupt the status quo, it would raise the price for the Netanyahu government on continuing on the current path, and it would maybe incentivize Donald Trump to do something himself. And that's the real key. If he can be incentivized to make this part of how he sets his own legacy, then Prime Minister Netanyahu is captive to what Donald Trump wants to engineer.
The problem, Ambassador Paoli, is that for Emmanuel Macron, when he's speaking to Donald Trump, it's kind of a three-ring circus. There's the Middle East, but there's also the trade negotiations. And we saw what happened to French wine last week, not getting included in that, which is upsetting to his constituents. And there's, of course, Ukraine, where Europe needs the United States. So at this point in time, how do you see this run-up to September the 23rd? What more can President Macron do?
Well, first of all, it's not because things are difficult that you shouldn't try to do them. As a diplomat, I mean, during my whole professional life, we've been trying to find agreements, negotiate, and I think that what we're trying to do now is the right thing to do. The first thing probably is to insist on the situation now in Gaza, on stopping the war. I think this is the first step, and we should be working on that. Second, create again. I don't know how the conversations go between President Trump and President Macron. I'm not in those talks, but I think that what we're doing now what France and other partners are trying to do with the Saudis and others is trying to create a momentum. And this is what we have to do. So stop the war. This is the first step, as was said before. And second, by recognizing what the Palestinian state, which is what we're aiming at, to bring back on the table the two-state solution. So I think this is something that we have to work on. And probably, I hope that the public opinion in Israel, even though chances are slim for the time being, according to Alon Yakter, but maybe things will evolve with the mobilization of the civil society in Israel and convince Israelis that Israeli opinion that where the interest of Israel, its security, don't rely on force only, but on a negotiated settlement. I think that this is what we have to work on, and this is what I think the ongoing efforts are aiming at now.
Alan Yakter, this recognition of a Palestinian state, we know it's anathema to those inside of Benjamin Netanyahu's government, but do ordinary Israelis care? After all, it's a mostly symbolic gesture at this point.
I think at this point, because Israeli society, again, and this disconnect from global public opinion, Israeli society is still living the October 7th attack. The idea of a two-state solution we see in our surveys is in an all-time low. And so long, at least as the war prolongs, it's not really gaining any traction. At the same time, I do agree with Ambassador Pauli's earlier point about there is absolutely no discussion right now about the alternatives. So when the two-state solution was more popular, it mostly relied on the talking point that the alternative is worse. The alternative is basically a single state where Jews would be a minority. This is, from Israeli eyes, the destruction of the Jewish state. So I think this discussion is important, and maybe in the longer term, it would help change things a bit, but we need the war to end first. Israelis are still very defensive right now.
Still very defensive, Nomi Bar Yaakov.
Yes, and I think with the two states, what is missing is no one, not Europe, not the Gulf, not the US, is explaining to Israelis how a Palestinian state is going to make Israel more secure. And unless the security guarantees, you are continuously hearing about security guarantees in the context of Ukraine and Russia, an Article 5 type NATO guarantee. Israel would like, for Israelis, it's not at all clear. It's clear to the Arab states. They say, oh, well, there's going to be normalization. But the fact there's going to be a peace treaty signed isn't in and of itself sufficient without security guarantees that are very clear and are along the lines of an Article 5 NATO, especially after the 7th of October. And unless that discussion is brought in alongside what President Macron and Crown Prince bin Salman of Saudi Arabia are doing, then it won't go anywhere. So you've got a rhetoric of, okay, there's a declaration of a Palestinian state. No one knows exactly the borders of the state. It's obviously not going to be on the 67 borders. And they'll have to make some one-to-one adjustments and where. And the one-to-one adjustments are fine. This is for the experts. We understand this. But what about the simple person who wants to know how to vote and whether he's going to vote or he or she are going to vote for a leader in the next election that is pro-two-state? No one is actually going to advocate two states in the next elections in 2026 unless this is explained. And everyone, I think the vast majority of Israelis would like to see peace with Saudi Arabia. And you, Francois, you mentioned earlier Tom Barak. Tom Barak is doing an incredible job both in Syria and in Lebanon, and we'll hear in the week you mentioned, 23rd of September, he will make the announcement of the progress that he's made both in Lebanon and in Syria, and there will be agreements with Israel on both. Not peace agreements yet, but we know this is incremental. And in Syria, they've reached an agreement, again, very quietly behind the scenes on sort of understandings of where, what degree of involvement, sort of as such, Israel can have. So the lines, Israel went so far in with so much force, and it was dangerous. And it was very, very dangerous for Israel and very dangerous for Israeli-Syrian relations. And everyone would like to see a stable Syria, and Israel was a destabilizing factor. So in order to ensure stability for Syria, you're also making progress in the relationship between Syria and Israel, and the same in Lebanon. There's a disarmament of Hezbollah. Israel today offered to disarm Hezbollah. Of course, Israel's not going to assist the Lebanese armed forces. But Tom Barak has done really an exceptional job, both in Lebanon and in Syria, and he can move on. And this is part of the trajectory of what we need to do before the 23rd of September. We need to work cohesively on the whole region and not just on one bit or the other. But I state again, the ceasefire deal is on the table, and there needs to be pressure to get that in. And once that is in, then you do top down and bottom up, and the blueprint is on the table. It's just a question of political will and the ability of diplomats to work together, and not just bilaterally. It's not about which leader is going to score more points. It's about getting to stability and ultimately peace.
And the guns have to go silent first, you say. Nomi Bar Yaakov, I want to thank you. I want to thank John Linden. I want to thank as well Patrice Paoli for joining us from the Ardèche region in southern France. Alan Yachter in Tel Aviv. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.